March 29th, 1867. Washington, D.C., 11 o'clock at night. Edouard de Stückel, the Russian minister to the United States, knocked on William Seward's door. The Secretary of State was in the middle of a card game with his family. Stückel delivered the news. St. Petersburg had approved the sale. They could sign the treaty tonight if Seward wished. Seward put down his cards. "Why wait until tomorrow?" he said. He sent word to the State Department to light the building and call in the clerks. At 4 in the morning on March 30th, 1867, the two men signed a treaty transferring 586,000 square miles of North America, a territory larger than Germany and France combined, larger than Texas and California and Montana put together, from the Russian Empire to the United States. The price was $7.2 million, 2 cents an acre. Russia was selling 1/5 of its entire American holdings for less than the cost of a modest warship. Within days, newspapers were calling it Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox, Andrew Johnson's Polar Bear Garden, a frozen wasteland purchased in the dead of night by a Secretary of State so desperate to make a deal that he couldn't wait until morning to sign it. They were wrong about the Folly, but the midnight signing, the card game interrupted, the clerks called out of bed to notarize a purchase that would reshape a continent. That detail is real. This is the story of how two men, one on each side of a dying empire's accounts, pulled off one of the strangest real estate transactions in the history of the world. Russia's claim to Alaska began, as most empires begin, with someone going somewhere they weren't supposed to and finding something valuable. In 1741, Vitus Bering, a Danish explorer in Russian service, crossed the strait that would one day bear his name and reach the Alaskan coast. He found sea otters. Tens of thousands of them, thick along every island and inlet, their pelts so dense and lustrous that a single skin could fetch a small fortune in the markets of China. The Promyshleniki, Russian fur traders, rough men operating at the far edge of the world, followed Bering's route into the Aleutian Islands within a decade, and what followed was the fur rush that preceded every gold rush by a century, brutal, profitable, and ultimately self-destroying. The Aleut people paid the first price. The Promyshleniki took hostages, women and children held in Russian camps, while the men hunted, and worked the hunters until they dropped. The methods were simple and effective. If a village refused to supply hunters, the Russians burned their food stores. If the hunters didn't bring enough skins, the hostages didn't eat. The system extracted labor from an entire population by holding its most vulnerable members. 80% of the Aleut population died in the first 2 generations of Russian contact, mostly from diseases against which they had no immunity, but also from overwork, violence, and the simple collapse of societies whose fabric the Russians had torn apart. By the time the Russian-American Company was chartered in 1799 to monopolize the fur trade, the Aleuts who remained were effectively serfs, their kayaks and hunting skills now assets on a company balance sheet. The capital of Russian America was New Archangel, today's Sitka, built on the southeastern coast of Alaska in 1804. At its peak, it had 968 residents, 116 log cabins, and the pretensions of a proper colonial capital, a governor's residence, a cathedral, a library, a school. Visitors described it as a surprising place, more orderly than expected, with flowers planted in window boxes and Russian Orthodox church bells marking the hours across the bay. But appearances were deceiving. New Archangel was the showpiece of a colony that had never solved its fundamental problem. It was too far from everything. Supply ships from St. Petersburg arrived every 2 or 3 years. Not every year, every 2 or 3 years. In the gaps between ships, the colony subsisted on salt fish, dried meat, and whatever could be coaxed from gardens that fought the climate to a draw. The Russian-American Company imported grain from California, ice from Alaska to San Francisco, and excuses from everyone. When a ship was late, people in New Archangel went hungry. When a ship was very late, people died. The company that was supposed to be extracting wealth from the colony was spending most of its revenues simply keeping the colony alive. The fur trade that justified the whole enterprise was meanwhile doing what fur trades always do, running out of animals. Sea otters, hunted without restraint for 60 years, were nearly gone from the waters they had once crowded. In the 1790s, a skilled Alayut hunter working the Aleutian Islands might take 100 skins in a season. By the 1840s, the same waters might yield 5. The Russian-American company's profits fell through the 1840s and kept falling. Its charter came up for renewal in 1861, and the debate in St. Petersburg over whether to renew it was really a debate about whether the colony was worth keeping at all. By the time Alexander II became Tsar in 1855, Alaska was a liability dressed up as a possession. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 hit Russia like a verdict. The empire that had crushed Napoleon, that had marched into Paris, that considered itself the dominant land power in Europe, was beaten by Britain and France on its own peninsula, in a war fought partly over who got to protect Christian pilgrims in Jerusalem. The losses were staggering. Roughly 500,000 Russian soldiers dead, most from disease rather than battle. The debt was worse. Russia borrowed heavily from European banks to finance the war and ended it poorer than it had entered. The lesson Alexander II drew from the Crimea was one that would shape every strategic decision he made for the next decade. Russia could not defend its distant possessions against the British Navy. Britain had demonstrated in the Black Sea what it could do when it had naval superiority and a motivation to use it. It had also demonstrated this, more quietly, off the Alaskan coast. A British squadron had sailed through Alaskan waters during the war, and the Russian garrison at New Archangel had no answer for it. The colony had watched British warships pass from shore and done nothing, because there was nothing to be done. Alaska sat directly in the path of British Columbia. In any future war with Britain, and the Crimea made another war seem not just possible but likely, the Royal Navy could steam north from Victoria and take New Archangel before St. Petersburg even finished writing its orders. The colony had no fortifications worth mentioning. The garrison numbered in the dozens. Russia would lose Alaska the moment it became strategically relevant, and would lose it to the one power most capable of using it against everything Russia wanted in the Pacific. Alexander's younger brother, Grand Duke Constantine, put the argument plainly in a memorandum to the Tsar in 1857. The United States was going to expand across North America regardless. It was inevitable. Better to sell Alaska to the Americans now, for money Russia needed, and use the sale to bind the Americans closer to Russia and further from Britain, than to wait until Britain simply took it. Alexander wrote 2 words on the front of the memo: worth considering. The decision was made in principle that year, a decade before anyone signed anything. What remained was the question of timing, of price, and of finding an American willing to buy. William Henry Seward had wanted to be President of the United States since before most people alive in 1867 had been born. He had run for the Republican nomination in 1860 as the clear frontrunner, the man everyone expected to win, and lost to a one-term congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln, who almost nobody outside Illinois had heard of 6 months earlier. Seward became Secretary of State instead, served through the Civil War with genuine distinction, survived an assassination attempt on the same night Lincoln was shot. A man burst into his bedroom and stabbed him repeatedly in the face, and Seward lived and entered 1867 as a political figure of enormous experience and zero future. He was ill. The knife wounds from 1865 had left him permanently disfigured, his jaw held together by a metal brace, one side of his face collapsed. He walked with a cane. He was aligned with President Andrew Johnson, who was marching toward impeachment and taking anyone near him down with the wreckage. The radical Republicans, who ran Congress, despised Seward almost as much as they despised Johnson, viewing him as the moderate face of a president they considered a traitor to the Union's war aims. Every territorial ambition Seward placed before Congress, Greenland, the Danish Virgin Islands, Hawaii, a canal route through Central America, was killed or shelved without ceremony. He was a man with a vision and no political capital left to spend on it. Alaska was the one he could get. He had been signaling interest to the Russians for years. As early as 1864, he had told the Russian government through intermediaries that a conversation about Alaska would be beneficial to us and by no means unprofitable to Russia. When Steckel arrived at the State Department on March 11, 1867, and said he was authorized to receive an offer, Seward didn't play it slowly. He went to President Johnson that afternoon and came back the next day with a number, $5 million. Then, before Steckel even countered, Seward raised it himself to 5.5. Steckel, who had been instructed to accept anything over 5 million, was watching a man negotiate against himself. Steckel held out for 7 million. Seward agreed. Then Steckel tried to add conditions about the Russian-American company's outstanding debts. Seward refused to absorb the debts, but added $200,000 to the price to compensate. $7.2 million, less than 2 cents per acre. The treaty went to the Senate the same day it was signed. What Seward had gotten, or believed he had gotten, was the first piece of a Pacific empire. Alaska was a stepping stone to Asia, a base for American ships to dominate the northern Pacific, a signal to Britain that the United States intended to surround British Columbia until Canada fell into American hands like a ripe fruit. That was the vision. Whether any of it was realistic didn't matter much in March 1867. What mattered was that at 4 in the morning, with exhausted clerks watching, 2 diplomats had signed the thing, and it was done. The newspapers hit the next morning. Horace Greeley's New York Tribune called it a frozen wilderness. The New York World called Alaska a sucked orange. Everything of value already extracted, nothing left but ice. The World's editorial noted that the territory had been foisted upon the country at 1 o'clock in the morning. They got the hour slightly wrong, and was a dark deed done in the night. Congress had not been consulted. The public had not been prepared. A Secretary of State with a ruined face and a dying political career had spent $7 million of public money in the middle of the night on a territory most Americans couldn't find on a map. The specific cruelties of the mockery are worth savoring. Journalists called Alaska Walrussia. They called it Seward's icebox and Johnson's polar bear garden. Editorial cartoons showed Seward dragging a block of ice across the Capitol, while President Johnson watched approvingly. One newspaper calculated that the $7.2 million could have bought enough winter coats to clothe every American living north of Philadelphia. Another pointed out that Russia had been trying to sell Alaska for years and couldn't find a buyer, which was perhaps a signal about its value. The Chicago Tribune suggested that the money would have been better spent on anything else: roads, schools, debt reduction, a small war. But the Senate ratified the treaty 37-2, 4 days after it was signed. The speed is the interesting part. The public mockery was loud, but the political establishment was paying attention to different arguments. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, the most powerful Republican in the Senate, and a man who had barely spoken to Seward in years, stood on the floor for 3.5 hours and delivered one of the most detailed speeches ever given about a piece of real estate. He cataloged Alaska's resources, its fisheries, its timber, its mineral possibilities, its strategic position commanding the northern Pacific. He gave the territory its name, Alaska, from the Aleut word Alyeska, meaning the Great Land. He argued that Russia had been America's most reliable European ally during the Civil War, when Britain and France had flirted with recognizing the Confederacy, and that honoring this deal was a matter of good faith. 37-2. The treaty was through in a week. What was not through was the money. The House of Representatives had to appropriate the $7.2 million, and the House had other things on its mind. President Johnson fired his Secretary of War in February 1868 in deliberate defiance of the Tenure of Office Act. The House entered articles of impeachment the same month. For the next 4 months, the United States Senate conducted a trial that consumed every political conversation in Washington. The Alaska appropriation, Russia's $7.2 million, sat in committee while senators argued over whether the president should be removed from office. Steckel had handed over a continent. He had been in Washington for 15 years, had cultivated relationships with American politicians across 2 administrations, had orchestrated one of the largest territorial transfers in the history of the hemisphere. He had delivered Alaska. America had been living in it since October. The flag was up, the soldiers were there, and Russia had received nothing. He wrote to St. Petersburg in March 1868 explaining that the impeachment proceedings had made it politically impossible to move the appropriation. He wrote again in April saying the trial was nearly concluded and payment should follow shortly. He wrote in May saying the acquittal of Johnson, the Senate voted 35 to 19 to convict, one vote short of the two-thirds required, had changed the political calculation in ways he was still assessing. Each dispatch required him to explain, in diplomatic language, why a sovereign nation was waiting more than a year to be paid for territory it had already surrendered. The check finally arrived in August 1868, 14 months after the signing. The formal transfer had happened 10 months earlier. The flag ceremony itself had a moment. The Russian colors got tangled in the rigging as they were being lowered at Sitka. The soldiers pulling the rope couldn't free them. A Russian sailor climbed the pole to cut the flag loose, and it fell onto the bayonets of the Russian honor guard below, not into the hands of the American officer waiting to receive it. The crowd watched a man climb a flagpole to cut down the Empire's colors with a knife, while soldiers held their bayonets out below. Some of the Russian residents in Sitka wept openly. Many of the indigenous people in the crowd, Tlingit, who had never submitted to Russian rule and were watching one foreign power hand their land to another, said nothing that the Russian chroniclers recorded. The check arrived in August 1868. Treasury warrant number 9759 for $7.2 million made out to the Russian minister. Steckel converted it to gold in London. Most of it went not to the Russian government, but to American contractors, the Winans brothers of Baltimore, who had a railway construction contract with the Tsar and were owed money. The exact routing of the funds was murky enough that American newspapers immediately suspected bribes had been paid to members of Congress to secure the appropriation. Steckel himself reportedly received $100,000 in fees. The paper trail was incomplete. No one was charged with anything. Russia took what remained and turned its attention east. The Amur River Basin, Vladivostok, the Pacific coast of Asia, which offered better ports and more promising trade routes than anything Alaska had ever produced. The sale looked, from St. Petersburg's vantage point, like a sensible liquidation. Turn an indefensible liability into cash, strengthen the real Pacific position, and use American goodwill as a buffer against British pressure. What Russia had given away became clear in stages, and each stage arrived like a slow embarrassment. In 1880, gold was discovered near Juneau. Scattered placer strikes in river gravel, enough to draw the first wave of serious American prospectors. In 1896, the Klondike strike just across the border in Canada's Yukon sent 100,000 people north. The towns of Skagway and Daya, which had been fishing camps when Russia sold Alaska, became the busiest ports in the Pacific Northwest within 6 months. Every prospector heading to the Klondike passed through American Alaska to get there. The territory Russia had sold for 2 cents an acre was processing millions of dollars in gold every year, and the American towns growing up around the rush bore no resemblance to the 116 log cabins of New Archangel. In 1968, oil was discovered at Prudhoe Bay on Alaska's North Slope, the largest oil field in North American history, containing roughly 25 billion barrels of recoverable crude. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline built to move it south took 3 years and $8 billion to construct. It runs 800 miles from Prudhoe Bay to the port of Valdez, crossing 3 mountain ranges and hundreds of rivers. The oil that has moved through it since 1977 has generated enough revenue that Alaska today pays its residents a dividend simply for living there. In a good year, every Alaskan man, woman, and child receives over $2,000 as their personal share of a resource that sits underground. Russia sold for less than it costs to park a car in Manhattan for a month. The total value of resources extracted from Alaska since 1867, gold, oil, fish, timber, minerals, runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars. The $7.2 million Russia received, adjusted for inflation, amounts to roughly $130 million today. The return on the other side of that transaction is incalculable. Seward did not live to see much of the vindication. He died in 1872, 5 years after the purchase, still reviled by most of his contemporaries as the man who wasted $7 million on ice. His house in Auburn, New York, preserved today as a museum, contains a globe he kept in his study on which he had traced his vision of American expansion. Alaska circled, the Pacific routes marked, the outlines of an empire sketched in pencil by a man whose ambitions always exceeded his moment. He got the Alaska piece. The rest, Canada, Greenland, the Danish islands, never happened, or happened much later under other men's names. In his last years, a journalist asked Seward what he considered his greatest achievement as Secretary of State. He answered without hesitation, the purchase of Alaska. Then he added that the full importance of it would not be understood for another generation. He was underestimating. It took 3 generations and an oil field. Steckel fared less well. He resigned from the Russian diplomatic service in 1869, moved to Paris, and spent the remainder of his life in comfortable European obscurity. The sale he had engineered was never celebrated in Russia the way the Louisiana Purchase is celebrated in America. It was a transaction, not a triumph. The Russian government that had approved it spent decades quietly not mentioning it. Alaska itself spent 30 years in a kind of administrative limbo. The territory was governed briefly by the Army, then by the Treasury Department, then by the Navy, then by nobody in particular. There were no courts, no civil government, no legal system. People who committed crimes in Alaska in the 1870s operated in a jurisdiction so undefined that prosecution was essentially impossible. One federal official described Alaska during this period as being governed by no visible rule at all. $7 million had purchased a territory the United States then proceeded to ignore for a generation. The Americans who did go to Alaska in those early years found a place that felt genuinely abandoned. The Russian residents of Sitka, clerks, company employees, the wives and children of administrators, packed their belongings and departed on ships back to Russia. They left behind their church, their cemetery, their Orthodox icons, nailed to walls they had lived inside for decades. The Creoles, men and women of mixed Russian and indigenous descent, who had been promised American citizenship by the treaty, found themselves in a legal gray zone, neither Russian nor quite American, in a territory where the new sovereign had sent no judges, no teachers, no courts to process their status. A garrison of American soldiers, bored and poorly supplied, occupied the governor's residence and waited for orders that were slow to arrive. The Tlingit, who had never surrendered to Russia and whose leaders watched the transfer ceremony at Sitka with unambiguous fury, pointed out that Castle Hill, the promontory where the flags were exchanged, was the only land Russia had ever actually controlled. Russia was selling what it did not own. The legal question of indigenous land rights went officially unaddressed for over a century, until the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971 finally created a framework for resolving what 1867 had simply transferred past. What the purchase was, stripped of the mythology on both sides, was 2 men in a room at 4 in the morning, each selling the other something they needed. Seward needed a legacy. Steckel needed to close the deal before someone changed their mind. Russia needed the money and the strategic relief. America needed the territory, even if most Americans didn't know it yet. The deal made sense to exactly 4 people in March 1867. Seward, Steckel, Alexander II, and possibly Charles Sumner. Everyone else came around later, or not at all, depending on when they died. The Russian flag that fell on the bayonets in Sitka was eventually retrieved and sent to Washington. It is in the Smithsonian today, a piece of fabric that represented 100 years of empire in a place that produced sea otter pelts and then waited to be discovered. Russia got its check 14 months after signing. Steckel converted it to gold. The gold went to Baltimore. The territory went to the Americans, who spent 30 years not knowing what to do with it before the gold arrived, and another 100 before the oil did. 2 cents an acre. The land under the Prudhoe Bay oil field alone, if valued at current oil prices, is worth more than everything Russia has ever earned. From the sale multiplied by a factor that makes the original $7.2 million look like a rounding error. That is the real mathematics of Seward's folly. Not that America overpaid, but that Russia had no idea what it was sliding across a desk at 4 in the morning, while exhausted clerks watched and a card game sat unfinished on a table across town. Seward picked up his cards again, presumably, when it was done. He had just bought Alaska.